Okay, thanks for coming to this Clean Energy Research Group talk. This will be the last one of the academic year, and then we'll start up again in fall. So we have the talk once a month, and we are a network of over 150 professionals, researchers, policymakers, and members of the media, people who are interested in climate transition and practical ways to try to make that transition away from fossil fuels. I'm sure that a lot of you feel the same way that I do, which is a great level of frustration at the lack of activity and action, and particularly the lack of policy leadership. And of course, with the new president doubling down on fossil fuels, we seem to have taken a step backwards. So it's really important for us as academics to step out into the real world and make our research available and of practical use to people who are making decisions in Canada and elsewhere. And so the Clean Energy Research Group was started as a group to try to fill that gap between the academic research and those who need information but don't have the expertise. So you'll see on our Clean Energy Research Group website that we've got 14 different policy papers. We're constantly expanding our network, and we're open to participation by anyone who wants to use this as a forum to share their knowledge or to bring up issues or for us to link you to experts that might be helpful in whatever you're doing. We're also particularly interested in going beyond just the policy papers and engaging with communities, NGOs, and activists to try to move forward the agenda on climate change. So today we have someone who actually fits all of those bills, a person who's a researcher and an activist. Omri has just completed his MA project in the School of Communication here at SFU, and it was focused on the ability of BC and Canada to implement agrivoltaics. So agrivoltaics are a combination of agriculture and solar energy production on the same land, and it offers incredible advantages in terms of climate change mitigation, advantages in terms of moving to clean energy. We know that agriculture is a significant user of fossil fuels and an emitter for a variety of points along the supply chain, from food delivery and transportation to fertilizer. And we know that, increasing weather variability is going to highly affect agriculture. We just take the fact for granted that we have low food prices, but that's not always going to be the case, especially as climate change starts to kick in and starts to affect our ability to grow our crops. So agrivoltaics is a way to mitigate that variation. Omri has a great background for this. He's worked on food security for the past 15 years, including running a farm, creating food cooperatives, and helping to work on community food security programs, as well as Indigenous-led food forests and public parks. And so as he begins his next chapter now, he's going to be using comparative public policy analysis and political economy to promote agrivoltaics as a way to solve both energy and food security problems. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Omri, and you can just share the screen and start your presentation.
Okay, excellent. Can everyone see the slide? I guess this is it.
Yeah, they can.
Okay, perfect. I just want to thank everyone for being here so much, and recognizing that this is unceded ancestral territory of several First Nations. Please come in. Hi. And also I want to thank Dr. Hira for setting up the Clean Energy Research Group. I think it's really important for us to have platforms for alternative ideas, and in the immortal words of Milton Friedman, sometimes when there's a crisis, it really depends on which ideas are lying around. So I hope that this idea can lie around, not for very long. I hope that it's picked up by policymakers and others with a lot of haste given our current intertwining crises that we're all facing. I don't need to go into that very much more. So this is a presentation about agrivoltaics. I'm going to try and keep it relatively short so there's more opportunity for engagement, but like anyone who's gotten really nerdy about academia, I really have quite a bit to share. So we'll see how this pans out in that regard. But I'll ask that people write down or remember questions or comments for the end of the presentation. These are some of the questions and some of the points that I'm going to be addressing throughout the presentation, and I look forward to remaining in touch with everyone as well after this. So why is agrivoltaics important for BC? What's so important about it? What are the challenges facing BC and its food systems as well as its energy systems? How can agrivoltaics address these challenges? And then what are my policy recommendations? Okay, first, here are the sections that I'm going to be going through, just so that everyone gets an idea of how this presentation is going to go. So first, I'm going to talk about what actually is agrivoltaics. So simply put, it's just solar panels with combination on agricultural. And so that's where the APV comes from, agricultural photovoltaics. So it's a way of using land twice or working with the land twice, depending on your parlance. And it's a form of renewable energy generation and agricultural production. The whole idea behind this is to preserve agricultural production and not eclipse it or replace it, because of course that is a major crisis that we're facing right now. I set the tone somewhat in this presentation, but I imagine that everyone who's here is here for a reason, and that you understand the multiple problems facing us today. So just a little bit of the technical aspects of what agrivoltaics actually is. You can see that nice little illustration there of different types of agrivoltaics arrangements. There are many more than this, and Dr. Pecunia, who's in the audience, has a great deal of understanding of the advents that are coming to the fore with photovoltaics right now. But this is circa 2022. But I believe it's we're seeing doubling of implementation of photovoltaics every 2 years now worldwide. So that also has to do with research and development. So lots of different ways to mount it, from 5 meters up in the air, which is sort of a more intensive system that is compatible with tractors, to just having on the ground for fields that are fallow, where there's more of a chance of it interfering with growing types. There's also vertical panels, horizontal panels, multiple axes, so it can follow the sun. And there's a great deal of research being done right now to talk about its compatibility with crops. I won't go into this too much because it gets pretty technical, but we're finding more and more that it's compatible with things like berries, leafy greens or brassicas, fruiting vegetables, and other types of fruit, grapes, cherries, and there's also a lot of research being done in Canada actually about strawberries recently, but it actually transcends a lot of the categories for plants and for agriculture, going from fallowed fields for pollinators to the traditional harvesting of vegetables to livestock, and etc., and even for ecosystem management, rehabilitation, and remediation. So there's a lot of considerations for design control. Other countries like Germany and South Korea and Japan have actually put forward stipulations in law around this, as well as Massachusetts. But there are a lot of points, not the least of which right now is tariffs and the increased cost of steel all over the world. But we don't have time to quite go into that. Making the case for agrivoltaics in BC. So chart on the right there shows that, this is from 2021, so it's actually a little bit out of date, but there is huge growth in agrivoltaics worldwide, that there is actual meta studies that show that there's considerable higher revenue in terms of levelized costs for agrivoltaics versus conventional photovoltaics. There's a 60% increase in efficiency for agrivoltaic modules in terms of life cycle assessments. And there is also evidence showing that most crops actually fare pretty well under agrivoltaics, up to around 40% shading. And this is kind of counterintuitive. I think the common notion is, well, if you're shading crops, you're going to have problems growing the crops. But actually, what we're seeing on the ground is something quite different, especially in tropical zones, but also in zones like here in BC, where most plants can get saturated quite quickly in terms of sun exposure, and so the agrivoltaics actually helps in this. I'll speak more to that in the coming slides. I'm just gonna gloss over this a little bit because of our time. There is a lot of benefit to integrating agrivoltaics, not just for farm use, so making sure that the electricity isn't just kept on the farm site, but integrating it into the grid more broadly. So that's mainly the thrust of my research, is what would it look like to bring agrivoltaics on board in BC in a broader sense, and how could we integrate it with the grid more broadly to get the most efficiency in terms of orders of magnitude or scale. So we can see here, while 90% of BC Hydro's energy comes from renewable resources, only 19% of energy for sectors like transportation, industry-specific use, and the building sector come from renewable energy. So while BC is quite renewable and very green in some regards, when it comes to these sectors, we're actually not. And so agrivoltaics also has an advantage between the grid scale and the local scale for providing energy to these sort of industries that's renewable. There is, a plan right now, C plan, just looking door, come in, that actually how this benefits BC to be fully electrified as opposed to having fossil fuels. And there's also wide compatibility with just keeping things at the local scale for agrivoltaics, especially for livestock, which is really energy intensive. Livestock production is really energy intensive. One other thing that's really interesting in the BC context is that past generations actually did us quite a favor by creating a vast hydroelectric system in the province. So this hydroelectric system is compatible with the intermittency of renewable energy. So we've got wind power, we've got solar power, but what happens when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining? Well, we can actually use our hydroelectric dams as giant storage batteries for energy. So as this diagram shows, during non-peak hours, we can pump the water up into the dam, and then we can release it for energy as it goes through turbines during the peak hours when energy is most in need. Why agrivoltaics? I haven't fully gotten into that so far, and unfortunately, because of time constraints, I can't go into all of these different reasonings, but I'll leave this here for a second as I sort of go into the more technical aspect of how, on an agricultural level, agrivoltaics helps crops. So a big problem, and I know this as someone who's tried farming and has done gardening quite a bit, your main problem is inputs. So as the sun shines throughout the day, and especially during the height of summer, you get a lot of evaporation. And that means that you're having to put in more water. And it also means that you get a lot of runoff. And what agrivoltaics does is that because it's placed above these fields, as this sort of sci-fi illustration shows us, it actually helps with evapotranspiration, which is a fancy way of saying that the water leaves the ground and evaporates. And so what you're left with is more biological activity in the ground, more water retention, less runoff into streams that are beside the agricultural fields, and less need for fossil fuel-based inputs, which is, of course, one of the major reasons that there's so much pollution in the world, and a big reason for nitrogen and carbon emissions, as well as other greenhouse gases, including methane. Just to say, better working conditions, that might be a head scratcher for some people, but what we're finding in BC, especially with the temporary foreign workers program and the lack of regulations and the inability for temporary foreign workers to go to different sites to work, is that we're seeing people leaving our province with actual physical ailments that are far worse than what used to happen before this era of climate change. There's an intense heat out in the fields, and what we're hoping to correct with agrivoltaics is that there might be some source of shade. Of course, this doesn't compensate for just good labor practices and treating people with respect, but there is a potential to offer people more shade because right now we're getting people leaving the country with organ failure or even worse problems as a result of their time spent in the hot sun. So specifically to BC, why is this so important in technology? Well, we already heard about why the BC hydro dam system has actually a lot of potential for mitigating this problem of intermittency in BC. That also, with the caveat that a lot of those dams were built on Indigenous land without permission, and so this isn't trying to blue sky the situation or say that this system is being built in a vacuum. Of course, it's a real world thing, and we've got to take into account these other problems that we're facing. But in addition to the renewable energy and the reduction of emissions, we also have increased stability for the grid because there's alternative sources of energy that are being put into the grid on a more micro level. It creates green jobs at all the different stages, especially if we take into account potentially getting the resources for the solar panels right here and vertical integration as well as circularity principles. If folks have questions about that, I can deal with that at the end of the presentation. And it also is one of the building blocks for increased food and energy sovereignty in the province so that people have some more control over these vital parts of our lives. One word I use a lot is peri-urban, which just means like beyond the suburbs. So like that strange zone between rural and urban, and how this actually has the capacity by a lot of measures to improve people's lives in that zone that's often neglected. Okay, so this is the part where I point out that our solar policy in BC is really lacking. You can see the chart on the right there shows our solar policy in Canada versus that shows our use of hydro versus other forms of electricity, solar being at the bottom, but BC in particular is really lagging behind the other jurisdictions. This is not for good reason. There is a lack of policy around this, and I'm hoping that agrivoltaics can actually contribute to that. There's, I guess, a contradiction in BC, which is that our highest zones of irradiance, where we have the most solar in the province, is also where people farm. It's some of the best farming. Now, of course, with the construction of Site C, there's even less farmland in the province. And so agrivoltaics presents this amazing solution where you can retain farmland while also maximizing these zones of irradiance. And what we're seeing compared to Germany, where they've enacted a lot of agrivoltaics, is that there's actually more sunlight in BC's Fraser Valley than there is there. One study from 2018 showed there's over 1,000 megawatts of low-cost solar. That's just the low cost, the low-hanging fruit of solar in southern BC. We have a lot of work to do. So, where are we going to get the support for these policy decisions? This is a recent StatsCan finding that shows, actually, sorry, I think this is improperly attributed. This is actually just from last year. But we're seeing that solar panels have the highest support amongst Canadians of any other form of energy. And you can see coal mining has 19%, fracking 31%, oil and gas 50% versus solar at 81%. And that's without a strong lobby group. So we're primed for it in a way, and Canadians are smart. We realize that we need a transition right now, and a just one. So these are some more stats on farmers, specifically in BC, but also more broadly in Canada. This is also a recent report from Statistics Canada about farmers' attitudes towards the environment and other things. But we see that there have been huge losses in BC due to climate disasters. 27% of BC's farmers have actually seen wildfires. This is in the past year, so that's 2023. And they're actually quite progressive around all these issues. 60% of farmers prioritize the environment and sustainability policies, and 3% of farmers in the Fraser Valley already use solar panels, and that's without any real type of incentive for a mass program like this. Although there are other programs that I'll get to. Not to harp on this, but there was a 90% loss of BC's stone fruit crop last year. And so we're in a state where we need to kind of either pivot or our farming industry is in big trouble. And I'm sure I'm not the first to say that. What's in it for the farmers? So there was a Solar Power Europe report just in November of last year that showed these 9 different ways that farmers can gain revenues through adopting agrivoltaics. I won't go into them too much, but there's also multiple ownership models. So currently, BC actually has quite a bit of small scale farming and farmers that own their land, but we have the most expensive farmland in the country. So there's all sorts of other options for farmers to make an income from this as well. And on the right is a little chart from a German study done last year about what actually contributes to farmer willingness to adopt agrivoltaics. Because people there have actually heard of agrivoltaics, so we can actually study it. What are the needs for agrivoltaics in BC? So I'll just continue with talking about this problem with our grid, which I don't think is actually overreported. People are citing this problem with our hydroelectric system for multiple reasons, and I think right now, especially the fracking industry and the energy industry are trying to use this to their advantage. But there is a real problem at the core of it, which is that 90% of our electricity comes from hydropower in the province. That's total power usage. And we're facing increased climate change problems. There's less meltwater, especially in the interior of the province, and that means that our dams, hydroelectric dams, are not producing as much energy. So we're actually drawing a lot of energy from the US. On top of that, there's a projected increase in electricity usage in BC. So you can see on the right, there's some stats that I gathered from a recent report from the Ministry of Energy on this. And what we see here is that over half of the increased amount of energy is actually coming from large industry, and yet they're not paying their commensurate share of the cost of increasing grid capacity. This is also from that same report from the Ministry of Energy, and it shows, you can see there's an inverse relationship between the amount of US imports we're taking in as BC and overall trade deficit that we're getting in terms of our energy usage in BC. And so it's also hurting bottom lines, so although of course this is far more than just bottom lines. Okay, so agriculturally speaking, we've seen a huge increase, as you can see from the stat on the right, in terms of fossil fuel dependence on farms. There's been a 77% uptick in on-farm fuel use in BC. That's according to the government's own stats. And this is not just the only problem, but there's also a crisis in terms of the insurance industry, of course, with climate change more broadly, but there's around a 60% subsidy in Canada of farm insurance. And that's going to get even more expensive as climate change becomes more and more pronounced. And a recent study from the US actually found a 5,000% increase in efficiency or savings in terms of insurance costs. as a result of taking on agrivoltaics. And we can go into that study later as well, or if you want to write to me. There's a lot of other problems as well. We're seeing shrinkage of farmland overall. This problem of subsidized crop insurance means 5.5 billion of Canadian taxpayer dollars are going towards that. Not that we shouldn't be doing it right now because farms are so important. And there's also, I think I'll just leave it at there because I'm worried about overwhelming people. Okay, so how do we actually implement agrivoltaics in BC? There are a lot of issues that we're facing in terms of the way that science has been implemented in the past and has excluded people. So we've got to deal with some problems in terms of communications, and of course my MA was in communications, so I deal with this pretty thoroughly in my discussion paper as well as my strategic communication plan. But there's a misconception that I addressed earlier around the rural space impact of photovoltaics as well as shading, so we need to address that. There's also a lot of regulatory barriers, including we have an agricultural land reserve here in BC. Thank goodness that was established in the early 70s, but it has pretty tight regulations necessarily. So what does it look like to have agrivoltaics as part of those regulations or accepted as part of those regulations? And then perhaps the biggest challenge right now is the high upfront costs related to putting in these systems for agrivoltaics. And I alluded to it earlier, but the increased cost of steel due to tariffs has really impacted the price of solar photovoltaics, despite the overall cost of photovoltaics going down quite a bit over the past decade or two. This is just another diagram that I made that shows that we're doing pretty well in terms of solar panel potential in BC, and this is from World Bank, a World Bank metric that's online. Okay, there are a lot of economic benefits to agrivoltaics, as I referenced earlier. There's a lot higher revenues available to agrivoltaics versus traditional photovoltaics. It can reduce the impact, it can reduce our dependence as a province on hydroelectricity, which we really need to do right now. It can stabilize income for rural people, for rural communities, for farmers and farm communities, for First Nations as well. And if implemented at a provincial scale or even a national scale, we can get the benefit of an economy of scale, which is really where this technology has its most impact. And so I recommend a few different policy options related to this. These are the ones that I looked into. So the status quo, what are the prospects for agrivoltaics with that? Our current system is over-reliant on hydroelectric, and this creates a lot of risks. And power production is quite centralized, which poses even more risk, especially during this era of climate change. If we were just to give subsidies towards people who are using agrivoltaics, it might incentivize adoption. However, if we wanted to go further, we could implement either a feed-in tariff program, which Ontario, Spain, Italy, and other jurisdictions have implemented, although that's fairly costly, and I'll speak about that a bit later. Or we can do a tender system, which is similar to the recent calls for power from the BC government that say, okay, we've got this contract for X amount of power, who's in for it, and how much can you deliver it for? So that's another option. And then what is the third scenario here for change is a combination of all of these. So subsidies, tender, and fit.
About 5 minutes.
Okay. So I won't go into this. This is how I sort of mapped out some of these policy scenarios and the potential benefits. but I'm glad to send this on. And I'm grateful to Dr. Hira for having forced this level of rigor in the work. And here's ultimately what I'm recommending. 1, introduce feed-in tariffs for between 1 megawatt of power and 40 megawatts to get the missing middle of power production for agrivoltaics. So this is above just like a smaller community level. This is for maybe a whole suburb worth of energy product, or a smaller suburb worth of energy production. 2, provide capital grants for agrivoltaics for its manufacturing in the province, as well as projects that implement it. And you can use all sorts of circular economics to multiply the impact here. 3, prioritize agrivoltaics in BC's upcoming calls for power. Maybe we have time for it. The next one's coming out in June, and from what I hear, BC Hydro folks, as well as the Ministry of Agriculture, don't really know too much about agrivoltaics, so there's a steep learning curve ahead if we're to implement it in the next month, but there's a call for power coming 2 years from here on in, so the next one will be 2026, but then 2028 after that. And then 4, recognize agrivoltaics as necessary farm use structure within the ALR categories. So I won't go into this too much. Italy has just committed $1 billion towards agrivoltaics. As I was saying, there are a lot of other jurisdictions that have this combination of technologies called agrivoltaics for over 20 years, especially Germany and Japan. But the US just passed a bill in Congress in 2023 around it. There's a lot of work going on in France, and there's also a lot happening in Spain as well. Yeah, I won't go into that too much. There's more broad lessons that I've drawn from through the German energy fund, which is their transition towards green energy, which started in the late 90s. And that's what influenced me to have this proposal for subsidizing the missing middle of energy production in the province. Finally, in conclusion, I'll just say we need to maximize this advantage that we have of our hydroelectric system for intermittent renewables. There are huge policy gaps right now that have seen a lack of solar in the province. And there's a lot of models to draw on here. We have the benefit of coming later when the costs are cheaper, and there's a lot of examples to draw on. Agricultural insurance would benefit in terms of government costs and individual farmer costs. And as I mentioned before, there's a need to do this right now. And so I think I'll just leave it at that. And thank you, Evan, for taking that.
Thanks, Omri. Can you stop sharing the screen so we can get to questions?
Sure.
So I think Omri has done a great job in summarizing very complex topic, but the main points are that we have clear solutions that are very feasible for dealing with climate change. What we lack is the financial capital, and the reason why we don't have financial capital is because there's inadequate policy support. And why is there inadequate policy support? There isn't enough push from the public. The public's too concerned about carbon taxes and the price of gas, and not enough about making the investments that are necessary to overcome carbon lock-in. So I hope that through your talk and through additional efforts that we're going to make, including a forthcoming CERT paper about this, we'll start to overcome that information gap. Narsh, did you have a question did you want to raise?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. So I had a question, but I want to first confirm what I understood from your presentation. So you mentioned that your strategy for facilitating this technology is to have it as a support for the current pumped hydroelectric storage technology, to use the energy from solar panels instead of storing it, using it to pump water and then use it at the time of use, at the time of high peak. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that's actually the BC Ministry of Energy came out with a paper last year when they also recognized the potential for our hydroelectric system to be used as these giant batteries for our electric grid.
Right. So then I have a follow-up question on that, because we all know that the solar production capacity is at its highest on the sunny, warm summer days. And then those days are also identified as the high peak and the time of the year that we need the highest amount of energy in the grid. So, how do you justify this overlap? And like, if we are producing that energy from solar, we would need to inject it immediately to the grid to use for that high peak demand. But you're suggesting to store it as a pumped hydro power instead of using the power at that time. Can you explain it? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good sort of point of clarification. I'm not saying that we should store it in all scenarios. Sometimes it can be immediately released into the grid, and there's a lot of work being done right now in microgrids that are able to supply energy on the local level too. But BC Hydro actually has a very sophisticated system for being able to release energy and distribute it in a way that centralizes it right now. And there's around $30 billion that BC Hydro is investing right now through its recent capital plan for upgrading the grid as well. So we're actually in a great scenario in BC for having these smart energy systems throughout the year.
So I see that Jesse Gill is also on the call. Jesse is also a pioneer in this area. Jesse, if there are any questions or comments you want to make, feel free to weigh in. My sense in regards to the last question, to answer it more directly, is that, as Omri pointed out, at times you'll need all of the electricity that's being produced by the solar panel, but there will be many times where you don't need 100% of that electricity. And therefore, you, through a net metering program, can feed that back into the grid. And so overall, it will be a net positive. Julie?
Yeah, thanks, Omri. That was really, really interesting. And I'm sorry if I missed these, but could I have two questions? Because I'm a newbie on the agri-solar side of things. Obviously, I focus more on the community ownership side. But one of them was about the kinds of crops. Like, have you looked at all about the regions of BC where, in terms of, because I think there are some crops, obviously you'd know so much more about this, right, that need full sun and others less so. That's kind of one thing I'm wondering about, whether that's clustered. So there are particular geographies of BC where this is more likely to be useful than others. I think there's some implications there. And then the other question was around the ALR, the Agricultural Land Reserve, right? And I'm thinking about potentially unintended consequences. So one of the things, I think some of the regulations maybe in the ALR might need to be amended to enable this on a large scale, and maybe just issues of, okay, well, if that, there's so much, I think, justified protection of the ALR, right? This worry about it getting overdeveloped for other areas. So I was just wondering whether you'd come up some of that in ways to address that, right? Protect it for agriculture still, but then enable these types of developments so we don't undermine the food production side of things, and try to get ahead of some of the objections you get from, environmental communities and whatnot.
Yeah, these are great points. I'll deal with the second one first, which is there is already a part of the ALR guidelines called necessary farm use structures. And I think that in the sort of interim period while we're getting this technology off the ground in BC, that is a great place for agrivoltaics to sort of sit. But in the long term, we're going to need to actually create part of the ALR guidelines that fits agrivoltaics. And I actually spoke with one of the agricultural land commissioners who sits on the board that sort of determines that governance model. And he said that their worry right now is that electricity production is so profitable it might actually convince farmers to just go into that instead of farming. And so we need to also be heading off that. And so I'll just reference the Agrivoltaics Canada folks, who it's our small fledgling lobbying organization in Canada. And they've done a little bit of work on this in terms of calling it Farmer First Solar. And so the whole aspect of agrivoltaics that's so crucial is ongoing cultural production. It's not agrivoltaics if you're just doing it for the sake of that monetary yield of electricity. And we unfortunately see this more broadly in agriculture in BC in terms of the ALR. There's a lot of people who are trying to squeak in between the different guidelines. But I think by and large, you can sort of head that off by having certain pieces of legislation passed, like, for instance, the German DIN-spec that they put out 2 years ago. It's sort of a industry-led guideline for people who are putting in agrivoltaics that says you must retain X amount of your yield that you had before implementing agrivoltaics. So there are ways of kind of dealing with it on that front. In terms of the best places to have agrivoltaics for yield, we need to be looking both in terms of crops and energy production. And actually, from the meta studies that I've been looking at, we're in pretty good shape on both counts. So I'll start with crops, which is that, as I was saying, most crops that have been studied through various shading studies show that you can have shading up to around 40% before you get a precipitous decline in terms of yield from agriculture. That differs for certain crops. And of course, we need more studies because a lot of the current shading studies are simulated with nets as opposed to using specific agrivoltaic technology. And so there's no one line on this. But what we're seeing in the tropical zones is that it's actually increasing yield because a lot of plants can only take around 2 hours of direct sunlight before they become saturated, and they spend more of their energy going down into their root ball in order to just sort of wear or to deal with the sun's sun exposure. So even a plant like a pepper, which we often all think of as a warm climate crop, it actually does have a pretty low saturation point for heat and sun. I think it's at around 28 degrees for 2 hours or something like that, before it becomes less ideal in terms of growing. As we face more climate change, that's going to be increasingly the reality in BC. But in terms of temperate zones, we also are seeing a lot of studies coming out of the States and more northern regions of Europe that show that we're not facing that big of a decline in crop yields, although certain crops you might want to plant alongside vertical agrivoltaics as opposed to more horizontal agrivoltaics. And there's a lot of ways to engineer this as well. And of course, every farmer really is an engineer as well because they're constantly working with their own system to maximize its potential. In terms of solar cultivation, we have seen the cost of energy for solar go down by huge amounts. I think it's almost by double every few years now. I don't have that stat offhand right now, but in terms of the point at which the system pays for itself through the amount of solar that you're able to either feed back into the grid or the amount of energy that you're saving in your own production, that's gone way down as well. So even if you're facing a climate such as coastal BC, where there's a lot of rain and a lot of days that are cloudy, it still has viability. But what I'm recommending through this study is actually focusing on southern BC in particular and the Fraser Valley.
I think Heitor, you're next.
Thank you. Nice presentation. Just using the point of the tropical areas, I'm from Brazil, and over there we did a AGPV system over there. And we are using instead of putting the soil, we are using aquaponics system in dry regions, and we have seen a lot of good results. So I think we can also focus not just in the soil, but if we use like hydroponics and solar panels to increase also the production, not just of vegetables, but also the protein of the fish. That's a very good point to be followed over here in BC as well. And also I think people focus too much in the large scale instead of just starting from the small scale. So in Brazil we saw that a system with 24 meters square, we can produce energy for like 5,700 kilowatts per year. So if you put like in large scale, imagine 1 million systems like that, we can have like 5.7 gigawatts of energy per year. So if we don't have so much financial capital to start something big, if we start from scratch a little bit, like 10 systems, 20 systems, 30 systems, just to start, I think we can put agrivoltaics in a good position. So government's gonna see how the potential of the agrovoltaics over here in BC.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Jesse.
Yes, morning everyone. I have a bit of an update. Yesterday, RDOS did authorize our non-farm use for the agrivoltaic system that we're putting in at Double Barrel. The condition that they put on there was to make sure that we were growing crops underneath. So it's kind of a circular argument where it's on-farm use anyway. So I'm waiting to see how the ALC handles that, because I have a notice of intent filed with them as an on-farm use for the solar system that I'm putting in. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Jesse. And the SERG is hoping to work with Jesse to try to elaborate a case study about his pioneering work in this area. So stay tuned for that. Narsh?
Thank you. Yeah, so another question. Actually, the area of work you're focusing on is kind of connected to my research at the C department. So I'm curious to see if you are similar to my research, if you're exploring the trade-offs of developing this technology in BC and what would be the potential both in terms of land use area change and also costs and emissions and their projection up to 2050. How do you think developing this technology would change the system, the energy system in general?
Wow. Thanks so much for that question. I feel I'm underqualified to answer it. What I was trying to do with this research is just sort of open up the Overton window on agrivoltaics. A lot of conversation happened around it, and provide people with a grounding of it from many different aspects. But I don't have projections around implementation at various scales. I believe Jesse's project that he just referenced is the first on-site or pilot project of agrivoltaics in BC. I also think that it's the first in Canada in terms of a vineyard. So we're in early stages of this, but I would love to pursue research on that. And please be in touch, or I'll get in touch with you if you send a quick email, because I'd love to learn more about your work.
Of course, yeah, sure. I would love to have a discussion with you after. And my other question is probably also out of the scope of your work, but I was curious if you're also considering the co-location of agriculture and wind power instead of solar power.
Yeah, I mean, I know just anecdotally, well, I guess more so than anecdotally, but there's a lot of research that was done out of Ontario after their feed-in tariff program happened in the early 2000s, and public pushback against wind power. But I'm not aware of that much in terms of feasibility studies for it in BC. And yeah, the sort of major part, the push of my research is around agrivoltaics as opposed to wind power. But yeah, I'd be curious to see comparable examples.
Awesome, cool, thank you.
Yeah, Narsh, definitely be in touch. We would love to collaborate with you to create some common research since we're both working on the same topic. I think the question about wind is certainly cheaper than solar, but it requires higher economies of scale, and it does tend to suffer more from the NIMBY effect, right, the not in my backyard effect, because it does tend to be larger and it has to be located in certain wind corridors to be effective. So the beautiful thing about solar is it's modular. It can be done on a very small scale, even though it's more expensive. And then it also has the precipitation trapping benefits and the shading benefits that Omri pointed out. So that's why solar tends to be more attractive in this regard. And in that sense, you know, when you consider the agricultural benefits, it offsets the extra cost of solar. And if we can add net metering to that, then you also diversify farmers' income. So that's why it's so attractive, because it's modular, scalable, and it has additional benefits. Ivana? You're muted still.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ivana Nikolic, and I work as a key account manager for BC Hydro. I have a range of agricultural customers, mainly horticulture customers, including various, food items plus flowers and cannabis. So we do have several solar projects that are developing and development stages. I have one project that is not in an agricultural, sphere, but it's getting implemented in a month or so, and we're talking about putting a number of solar panels on a former glass plant on the roof, and the generation coming out of it would be 1.1 megawatt. So we, as BC Hydro, we do have a few offers for the solar generation. So for capacities that are under 100 kilowatts, we do offer rebates. They're not that big. For industrial customers, it's $10,000 for solar and $10,000 for battery rebate. For anything above that, the only offer that we have as of now is demand response program, where the customers generate electricity, but only for their own use. So they cannot export anything back to our grid. Net metering option is available under 100 kV, but nothing above that. We had a call for power recently, and we had a number of participants. I believe there was majority of them were successful proponents. Actually, majority of them were wind generation, and one was a huge solar project. So that's there's a lot of activities happening on our end, but not that much on the agriculture side. I do have initiated two studies initiated for the solar, and both are for for two green. Both are for greenhouse applications. So, but that is still in very early stages. If you want me to, I can post the links for BC Hydro programs in the chat, so then you can have chance to go through it and see what are our offers.
Ivana, that is super helpful, and we would love to continue speaking with you as we do more research about the potential for agrivoltaics in the agricultural industry and how we can best support those possibilities. As my colleague Dr. Wright has pointed out in our first CERT working paper, and as you know, Site C is going to be wholly inadequate for our electricity needs, considering electrification of the whole transportation sector, and obviously just normal growing demand in BC. So I think that we're going to, obviously BC Hydro has already moved in this direction, but we're going to continue to need to diversify and increase the sources of energy. And the more diversity we have among different sources of energy and also different locations of energy, the less intermittency will be an issue. I think there was a question in the chat from E. Marin. It was, what sort of engagement have you done or are you planning to do with Indigenous communities in BC? And there's also a question in the chat for you, Ivana, from Marin.
Yeah, so I came out with 3 parts of my MA. One was the policy discussion paper, another was the strategic communication plan, and then another was a research essay. And in the research essay, I really took my time to explore the potential impact of agrivoltaics on Indigenous communities, as well as the history of energy projects within Indigenous communities. My own experience in terms of being an activist is that I've helped to work to fight against extractive projects that are located in Indigenous communities. Of course, we'd be remiss to not mention the Trans Mountain Pipeline, since we're literally on top of it right now here on the Burnaby campus of SFU, which was not consented to by the Tsleil-Waututh as well as other First Nations. But basically my analysis boiled down to it being a double-edged sword, where these energy projects, the renewable projects, can replicate these harmful patterns of extraction within Indigenous communities, but they can also empower Indigenous communities, as we've seen through numerous initiatives in Canada. And so for me, in terms of agrivoltaics, I don't want to replicate that pattern of extraction. I spent some time in Thunder Bay working for a food security NGO, and in talking with Indigenous people there, there's a common pattern of dumping technologies, especially on reserves and First Nations, in terms of greenhouses, etc. And so this needs to be approached from a principle of solidarity and allyship. And so I haven't reached out to my First Nations contacts at this point because my analysis is so meta, but that would be sort of the idea, is that now that this study is out there, we start to talk with First Nations about energy independence and renewable energy.
Yeah, and I think to add to
this is Elijah Morin here. Sorry to jump in there. I just wanted to say thank you
go
so
ahead.
very much for your response. And I'm a senior associate programs analyst for New Relationship Trusts, and I help oversee 2 different funding streams, one for on-grid and off, and then another one for off-grid Indigenous communities in British Columbia. And I just wanted to mention that I think that your paper is very topical and timely, and I think that I only make reference to the engagement on the many fronts. That one, we do hear a lot from communities throughout the province as it relates to self-determinism, food sovereignty that you had mentioned, but also developing meaningful, sustainable, and community-driven infrastructure. So I would, with your permission, maybe be willing to share your paper with neighboring communities. If you want, we can exchange details, but I'm very curious about your work as well in a little more detail and how you came to unearth, certain things in your research. But and I just wanted to ask if Ivana is still on the call, whether the rebate program as it relates to agriculture projects, if they're formatted similarly to the residential solar rebates, where you sort of need a technical viability approval, and then you get something of an access to the rebates, which is still pending. I'll jump off the mic. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
So for both offers that I discussed, and I posted links for each of them. So self-generation is our former net metering offer. Now it's called differently, but the same thing. And for low displacement, every time when we provide any kind of funding, it has to be, the application, the customer needs to submit some kind of application. And that application needs to be reviewed by our engineers and by sometimes, especially for low displacement, sometimes the study needs to be done, and the study needs to be reviewed by multiple groups within hydro before commitment to any incentive towards the solar installation or wind installation, because our low displacement offer is for all renewable, and it is associated with all renewables. So it can be wind as well, or biomass.
Yeah, so thanks again for your comment. Please get in touch with us so we can try to work with you, because obviously for remote Indigenous communities, this is of high priority, and we're working with Dr. Pecunia's lab, solar lab, to think about how to install agrivoltaics in greenhouses that would create a pathway for reducing diesel use and also creating food security, as you suggest. There's one last Yeah, go ahead. Two last questions. Go ahead.
Thanks. Great presentation, Omri. Thank you. I'm not an expert in either agriculture or solar energy, but I'm curious. This technology or application seems to be well suited for can be well suited for large industrial agriculture, monocrops. And I'm just wondering what considerations or different considerations would there be, especially with the greater acceptance today of regenerative organic agriculture, which involves a lot of different technologies or applications, but specifically a variation of crops. Are there any considerations, or have you found any in your research?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for being here too. So for me, as someone who practiced regenerative agriculture when I was farming to make sure that all of the nutrient cycle and the water and all the inputs that I put into my site were retained by the land and healthy for its ecosystem and for all of the biological diversity within the land, agrivoltaics is the natural extension in my mind, and because it allows for that biological diversity to be retained through less inputs and more retention of water. In terms of scaling, I actually think that I look to Dr. Pierce, Joshua Pierce, who is in Ontario, who is pioneering a lot of the engineering and agricultural research in Canada. And he looks at agrivoltaics from the point of view of appropriate technology, which is sort of this idea that technology should be used as it's appropriate to the person who's using it. So whether it's someone who is practicing smaller scale regenerative organic farming, hobby farm, or it's someone who's medium scale, who's producing for their area, or it's for a larger scale industrial farm, it should be compatible with all those things. And, Jesse Gill's example here of the vineyard is actually on the more intensive technology use. It's a relatively complicated system that's very novel in its approach, but I think agrivoltaics can be implemented in relatively basic terms, because when you think about it, it's really just solar panels on top of farms. So we're seeing this being implemented in a lot of different countries, in a lot of different ways, and now that solar is so cheap, the developing world is using it in terms of agriculture quite extensively, and we're seeing it especially in India right now.
That's another long conversation about Moby's big push on solar, but we'll save that for another time. There's one last question from Melanie. Would you also recommend engaging small-scale farmers, and especially their advocacy and marketing organizations, e.g. co-ops and others?
Well, I'm glad to have Melanie here, and she's just one of many mentors who I'm getting to speak with right now. But Melanie is involved in the co-op sector in BC, and right now I'm learning a lot about it through a course that I'm doing. But of course, co-op sector and small scale farming are some of the best ways for us to distribute the benefits of this technology. I think we've seen a pattern, especially when it comes to like the state intervening with technologies or adoption of certain technologies, where there's a one-size-fits-all solution and there's kind of a mega project solution. Think of like Site C as an example, or the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But what we also want to see is a distributed system that's more resilient. And we want to see circular economies that come from communities adopting agrivoltaics or being able to implement it at the scale that's appropriate to them, where you see maybe the dividends from selling the electricity back to the grid, it goes to a whole community, or maybe it goes to a cooperative that is an agricultural cooperative. There's several here in BC, including in the Peace region. There's a renewable energy co-op that does some work with farming, but cooperatives are one of the best ways to ensure that the dividends from this technology are widespread and that there's community control over it, rather than it being seen as yet another imposition on communities. So I didn't have much time to look into it. The work of Julie MacArthur, who was also on the call, really influenced me when it came to co-ops and the way that we can actually maybe even have the government incentivize co-ops to implement this technology through providing subsidies or encouraging them through adders. These are all things that I looked at, but had to put it into my appendices of the policy discussion paper.
All right, well, I hope you all join me in thanking Omri for an excellent presentation and a great end to the CERG talks this year. Thanks for being such a great audience too, and we'll be in touch over the summer with coming events from CERG, and please, if you know anyone that's interested in these topics, please have them reach out to me with an email so I can add you to the CERG list and we can continue the conversation. Right, have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Hope to see you soon.